Have you ever wondered how the intersections of race, gender, and the law can lead to the most irreversible of outcomes? In this video, we unravel the harrowing journeys of 9 black women who were sentenced to death row in the United States. From Lena Baker's battle for survival under Jim Crow to Erica Shepard's tragic fate as a vulnerable teenager, each story forces us to confront the deep flaws in our justice system. Join us as we explore these emotional narratives. Hit that like button, subscribe for more in-depth investigations, and brace yourself for a journey through true injustice. Lena Baker. Lena Baker's life unfolded under the relentless weight of Jim Crow-era injustice. Born in 1900 in rural Cuthbert, Georgia, she worked tirelessly to support her family as a housekeeper. In early 1944, she found employment with Ernest Knight, a local grist mill operator who wielded power over her daily existence. Knight's broken leg forced him to rely on Lena for both domestic tasks and companionship, but his treatment of her was far from benevolent. According to Lena's later testimony, Knight regularly threatened violence when she attempted to leave his employment. On the morning of April 30th, 1944, Lena decided she had endured enough. As she tried to depart the mill, Knight raised a cane to strike her. Fearing for her life, Lena seized a pistol she carried for protection and fired a single shot, instantly killing him. The legal machinery of 1940s Georgia moved swiftly against Lena. Within weeks, an all-white, all-male jury convicted her of murder, dismissing her self-defense claims outright. Lena insisted repeatedly that Knight's cane had been lifted to kill her, and that she acted in the only way she knew how to stay alive. "I done it in self-defense," she told the court, but her words fell on deaf ears. With minimal defense representation, no witnesses called to testify on her behalf, and no consideration of Knight's abusive history, Lena's trial lasted less than a day. The jury deliberated for barely 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict and sentencing her to die in the electric chair. Through her final months, Lena maintained her dignity, singing spiritual hymns and professing a steadfast faith. On March 5, 1945, at Georgia State Prison in Reidsville, she became the only woman in Georgia history executed by electrocution. Her last meal request was modest, a hamburger, and her final words echoed her belief in divine justice. "I have nothing in my heart against anyone. I am ready to meet my God." In that moment, a life already marked by hardship and resilience was extinguished by a system that refused to acknowledge her humanity. Decades later, Lena's story resurfaced as a stark illustration of racial and gender injustice. In August 2005, more than 60 years after her death, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles granted her a full and unconditional pardon. Investigations revealed that she should have faced a lesser charge, voluntary manslaughter, which would have spared her life. Though posthumous, the pardon acknowledged the profound failures of her trial and the broader patterns of discrimination that condemned her. Lena Baker's legacy endures as a testament to the intersecting forces of race, power, and survival in America's darkest chapters. Frances Elaine Newton. At just 21 years old, Frances Elaine Newton's life took a harrowing turn, fueled by desperation and greed. In early 1987, Newton lived in a modest Houston apartment with her husband Adrian and their 2 young children. Struggling to keep up with mounting bills, she purchased life insurance policies totaling $100,000 on Adrian and their infant daughter Farah. Tensions between Frances and Adrian had grown. Rumors circulated that Adrian dabbled in drug use, and their marriage teetered on collapse. On April 7, 1987, Frances claimed she left home to run errands and returned to find her husband, their son Alton, and baby Farah lifeless from gunshot wounds. Initially, she appeared as a traumatized wife and mother, but investigators quickly uncovered a darker truth. Police discovered that Newton had purchased a .25 caliber pistol 3 weeks before the killings. Ballistics tests matched this same weapon to the bullets recovered from Adrian, Alton, and Farah. Further investigation revealed gunshot residue on the dress Frances wore that day. Prosecutors argued that she meticulously planned the murders for financial gain, staging the scene to appear as though someone else had committed the atrocity. During the trial, Newton maintained her innocence, suggesting Adrian's alleged drug connections might have led to retaliation. Yet the mountain of forensic evidence painted an unmistakable picture. She had pulled the trigger on her own family. Throughout the 15-day trial, the prosecution presented a relentless narrative of betrayal and avarice. They detailed Newton's financial struggles, her insurance policy purchases, and her pattern of using proceeds from her husband's policy to cover personal expenses. Newton's defense attorneys challenged the integrity of the forensic testing and argued her emotional breakdown after discovering the bodies was sincere. But jurors were unconvinced. On April 23, 1987, the jury found Frances Elaine Newton guilty on 3 counts of capital murder, and she received a death sentence. Newton's appeals centered on alleged flaws in the handling of ballistics evidence and the destruction of potentially exculpatory materials before defense experts could examine them. Civil rights advocates also highlighted racial bias within the Texas justice system, arguing that a white defendant in similar circumstances might not face the ultimate penalty. Despite concerted efforts from legal teams and public outcry, every appeal faltered. On September 14, 2005, Newton was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit in Texas. For her last meal, she refused any special request and was served standard prison fare: chicken, corn, green beans, and sliced bread. Her final words resonated with faith and a haunting promise. "I love my family. I'm going to be with Jesus. I love all of you. I will see you when you get there." Frances Elaine Newton's story seared itself into the public conscience as a tragic testament to how desperation can erode moral boundaries and how evidence can both illuminate and obscure the human heart. Wanda Jean Allen. Wanda Jean Allen's trajectory seemed set from an early age. A troubled childhood in Oklahoma City, marked by instability, abuse, and emotional turmoil. Expelled from multiple schools and entangled in juvenile offenses, Wanda's potential was overshadowed by survival instincts. At age 20, she committed her first homicide, fatally stabbing her girlfriend Deetra Pettis after an argument. Convicted of manslaughter in 1981, Wanda served 5 years in prison. Upon her release, she grappled with undiagnosed intellectual disabilities and untreated trauma that left her ill-equipped to navigate life outside bars. In 1986, Wanda met Gloria Leathers at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, forging a relationship born of shared vulnerability. The two women cohabited for 2 years after release, moving into a modest apartment in Oklahoma City. Their bond, however, was volatile. Arguments flared over finances, trust, and jealousy. On December 1, 1988, Gloria broke things off and began moving her belongings out of their shared home. Unwilling to let Gloria go, Wanda clung to her, her emotional dependency fueling a dangerous desperation. That afternoon, Gloria sought to file a complaint at the village police department. Witnesses saw her exit the building with her mother. Behind them, Wanda appeared, clutching a .38 caliber pistol. The moment felt surreal. Gloria seeking closure, Wanda seeking control. A shot rang out, striking Gloria in the abdomen. Gloria was rushed to the hospital, but after 3 days of fighting for her life, she succumbed to her wound. Wanda was arrested on first-degree murder charges almost immediately. During Wanda's trial, prosecutors depicted her as a calculating killer, emphasizing her previous manslaughter conviction and the fact that she returned home to retrieve the gun before confronting Gloria. They portrayed the shooting as premeditated, a bitter act of vengeance by a scorned lover. Wanda's defense team struggled to present critical evidence of her low IQ, later revealed to be around 69, and extensive mental health issues. Documentation of her cognitive impairments was mishandled, and the jury never heard the full extent of Wanda's diminished capacity. Convicted of first-degree murder, Wanda Jean Allen received a death sentence. Appeals on her behalf cited constitutional prohibitions against executing individuals with significant intellectual disabilities. Civil rights activists, mental health experts, and even Reverend Jesse Jackson rallied for clemency, arguing that Wanda's brain simply processed anger and fear differently than a fully functioning mind. Yet the state board refused to intervene, and each legal bid for mercy failed. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was led into the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. For her final meal, she requested a bag of chips, a date-filled cookie, and a lemon-lime soda. In her last murmurs, she invoked both forgiveness and farewell. "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. I love everybody. God bless you all. I'm going to a better place." With those words, Wanda's life, punctuated by hardship, unrecognized disability, and haunting love, came to an unceremonious end, leaving behind a legacy that questioned the very foundations of justice, mercy, and human worth. Virginia Lehrer. The bamboo blinds rattled in the humid Florida breeze as Virginia Lehrer gazed at the family photograph on her living room wall. To the casual observer, she was a successful office manager married to a beloved dentist. But beneath her calm exterior simmered a secret that would shock an entire community. Born to a black mother yet possessing alabaster skin, Virginia had navigated life passing as white for decades. In March 1991, her carefully constructed world collapsed in a single, horrifying moment. Dr. Norman Lehrer, Virginia's husband, prepared to resume work after lunch alongside his dental assistant and their son Jason, who sat quietly in a back room. Suddenly, a masked figure burst in. A shotgun rattled, a deafening blast echoed, and Norman collapsed. In the chaos, the boy fled, terrified, as his teenage brother, stunned, struggled to make sense of the violence. Investigators quickly traced the shotgun to a plot that shocked even seasoned detectives. Virginia had manipulated her own son into killing his father, promising they could claim a multi-million-dollar insurance fortune. Courtroom doors swung open, and Virginia Lehrer's secret identity flooded under fluorescent lights. Prosecutors wove a narrative of betrayal, a devoted dentist butchered at the behest of the woman he loved. They painted Virginia as a manipulative mastermind who exploited her son's vulnerability and used her light complexion and fluid racial identity to evade suspicion. When Jason testified, his voice trembled as he recounted feeling trapped between loyalty and fear. "She said I had to do it if I ever wanted to have a life," he whispered through tears. This chilling confession haunted the jury as they learned how deeply Virginia's deception ran. Defense attorneys argued that the case hinged on circumstantial evidence and unreliable jailhouse informants. They tried to humanize Virginia, painting a portrait of a woman desperate for escape from a loveless marriage and constrained by societal expectations. They highlighted Jason's acquittal on grounds of duress, suggesting that a child coerced at gunpoint could not fully bear responsibility. Yet the jury saw only cold premeditation. In 1993, Virginia Lehrer was convicted and sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. Appeals revealed prosecutorial misconduct, critical evidence, notes of Jason's trauma, mental health evaluations, and exculpatory witness statements had been withheld from the defense. As the truth emerged, public outcry roared. Mental health advocates decried the exploitation of a teenager's psyche, and civil rights groups condemned how her racial passing had muddied perceptions of bias in the trial. After 15 years behind bars on death row, the Florida Supreme Court overturned her sentence, and in 2008 her punishment was commuted to life imprisonment. In her final statement before the governor's decision, Virginia's eyes glistened with remorse as she whispered, "I never wanted this for my son." The son she had once convinced to fire the fatal shot would grow into adulthood under the weight of his own actions. Though spared execution, Virginia Lehrer's legacy remains a haunting parable of how identity, manipulation, and desperation can converge in the darkest of ways. Kimberly McCarthy. A sharp September sun beat down on the quiet neighborhood of Lancaster, Texas, casting long shadows over manicured lawns. 52-year-old Kimberly McCarthy knew these streets well. She had lived here most of her life. Yet, on July 21, 1997, the facade of suburban tranquility shattered. Dorothy Booth, a 71-year-old retired therapist, opened her front door expecting to borrow sugar. Instead, she encountered Kimberly, the neighbor she had greeted daily. A butcher knife flashed in the afternoon light. Blood stained the porch as Dorothy fell, her final breath echoing in the stunned silence. Kimberly McCarthy calmly pocketed Dorothy's diamond ring, severed the victim's finger to ensure the gem was hers, and vanished into the Texas heat. As police combed the crime scene, neighbors whispered anxiously, wondering who could commit such a brazen act. Investigators soon unearthed a chilling pattern. Kimberly was tied to similar brutal attacks on elderly women Maggie Harding and Jetty Lucas. Though never tried for those murders, the evidence painted a portrait of a predator who stalked her victims under the guise of neighborly familiarity. She pawned Dorothy's ring and used stolen credit cards to feed her crack cocaine addiction, fueling both her hunger for violence and her spiral into darkness. Kimberly's trial ignited a firestorm of controversy when her defense team exposed how prosecutors systematically struck black jurors, ensuring an almost all-white panel. The courtroom became a battleground for racial justice. Civil rights activists argued that Kimberly's fate was sealed not solely by her crimes, but by the injustice that tainted the selection of her peers. Meanwhile, the prosecution offered no sympathy, depicting Kimberly as a remorseless killer who targeted those too vulnerable to fight back. Witnesses testified to her furtive visits to pawn shops and gas stations days after the murder, where she used Booth's cards to buy crack, as blood-stained clothing lay hidden under her bed. In June 2013, after 16 years of appeals, Kimberly McCarthy walked into the Texas death chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville. Texas had abolished special last meal requests, so she was served the standard prison meal. As the lethal injection coursed through her veins, she whispered with a clarity that sent shivers through witnesses. "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love you all." At 9:18 p.m., her heart stilled. Kimberly's death made headlines as Texas celebrated its 500th execution since 1982. Yet her execution reopened wounds over racial bias in jury selection, the privatization of pain, and how addiction can fuel unspeakable violence. Beneath the stark statistics lies the face of a woman whose final act was not a plea for mercy, but a demand to be remembered as human, even in her darkest hour. Carlette Parker. On a humid July morning in 1998, the laughter of children playing in suburban Wake County, North Carolina, masked a simmering tragedy inside a modest home on the lake. Carlette Parker, 34, worked as a home health aide, entrusted by families to care for their elderly loved ones. But behind her calm exterior, Carlett harbored mounting debts and a gnawing desperation born of a compulsive gambling addiction. Surveillance cameras recorded her making frequent withdrawals at local casinos. She was losing, month after month, until the weight of debt threatened to crush her entirely. 88-year-old Alice Covington was Carlett's latest client. Alice had entrusted Carlett with the keys to her life, her home, her savings, and her dignity. But in mid-July, Carlett hatched a plan that would forever shatter that trust. Instead of ensuring Alice's well-being, Carlett tampered with her medication, leaving the elderly woman vulnerable and disoriented. On the morning of July 15th, Carlett invited Alice on a relaxing boat ride to Jordan Lake. Alice, clad in her favorite floral dress, smiled as Carlett guided the motorboat away from shore. The gentle hum of the engine and the water lapping against the hull belied the horror that awaited. Mid-lake, Carlett pushed Alice overboard, watching in cold fascination as the frail woman's arms flailed in panic. Alice's last desperate attempts to stay afloat drowned beneath the ripples. When bystanders spotted Alice's motionless form and pulled her from the water, it was already too late. Carlett returned to shore, her mind numb with the illicit thrill of escaping her debts. Later that day, news of the drowning spread, igniting shock and outrage across the community. How could a caregiver, paid to protect the vulnerable, become their executioner? During the trial, prosecutors laid bare Carlett's financial ruin. Tens of thousands in gambling losses, mounting bills, and an arrest record for embezzlement from previous clients. They painted her as a cold manipulator willing to sacrifice a life for a jackpot. Carlett's defense argued that a momentary lapse in judgment, fueled by her untreated mental illness, bipolar disorder, and severe depression, clouded her moral compass. They introduced testimony from psychiatrists who described her manic episodes and suicidal ideations. Yet the jury remained unmoved. In 1999, Carlett Parker was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. As appeals navigated the fraught intersection of mental health and capital punishment, Carlett spent her nights on death row replaying Alice's terrified gasp each time she tasted water. Supporters of mental health reform decried her impending execution, arguing that Carlett's untreated psychological issues should have spared her life. In 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned her sentence, citing errors in jury instructions and concerns over how her mental health evidence was handled. Carlett's punishment was commuted to life without parole. By the time Carlett Parker's sentence was reduced, the nascent movement to recognize the role of trauma and mental illness in capital cases had gained traction. Today, her name is mentioned in legal circles as a cautionary tale of how desperation, untreated illness, and systemic failure can converge in a moment of heartbreaking violence. Carlett remains behind bars, haunted by the stillness of Jordan Lake and the weight of a life she could never take back. Lanya Taylor. On a sweltering August morning in 2004, 25-year-old Lanya Taylor found herself caught in a desperate tempest of mental anguish and battered motherhood. Living in a dilapidated mobile home on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, Lanya struggled daily with bipolar disorder and major depression, diagnoses she had fought silently for years. By mid-2004, her mental health deteriorated further when she lost custody of her 2 young children amid claims of neglect. Desperate to hold on to hope, and haunted by voices urging her toward a final act, Lanya purchased gasoline and strode into her mobile home with each child cradled in her arms. In one searing instant, flames erupted, consuming her children alive. Neighbors heard frantic screams before the entire trailer blazed like a beacon of tragedy in the rural Alabama heat. First, responders arrived to a nightmarish scene: charred remains and the acrid smell of burning flesh. Lonia emerged, convulsing amid the flames, clutching a gasoline canister in trembling hands. She surrendered quietly, her eyes hollow with remorse, as she whispered that she simply could not bear to see her children suffer in a world where she saw no future. Prosecutors painted her as a cruel murderer who intentionally set the fire for profit. She had recently taken out life insurance policies on her children, they alleged, echoing a narrative of greed. Yet the insurance amounts later revealed to be modest, paled against the magnitude of Lonia's mental collapse. At trial, prosecutors described the scorch marks on the children's bodies, the gasoline-soaked carpet, and the hushed testimony of neighbors who recalled Lonia muttering about ending it all. Every detail was leveraged to depict her as calculating and remorseless. Lonia's defense team sought desperately to convey the chaos that had consumed her mind. They presented medical records documenting her bipolar diagnosis and testimony from psychiatrists who revealed that Lonia had experienced psychotic breaks in the weeks leading up to the fire. A fractured childhood, marked by her own mother's untreated mental illness, and years in state-supported foster care had left her without a stable support network. On the stand, Lonia spoke in halting sobs, tears streaming down her face as she recounted voices that had promised relief through fire, not knowing the true cost until it was too late. "I love my babies," she cried. "I never wanted this to happen." The jury, however, struggled to reconcile the horror of the crime with the nuances of her suffering. Convicted of capital murder, Lonia Taylor was sentenced to death in late 2004. Appeals highlighted the profound failure to provide adequate mental health treatment, arguing that executing someone in her fragile state violated evolving standards of decency. Civil rights advocates and mental health organizations rallied, stressing that Alabama's system had abandoned Lonia when she needed help most. But each legal challenge faltered. In 2018, after 14 years on death row, a federal judge granted a last-minute stay, acknowledging that Lonia's mental illness had not been given its due weight. Her death sentence was eventually overturned and replaced with life without parole. Today, Lonia remains incarcerated, her case serving as a harrowing testament to how untreated mental illness, and a society ill-equipped to recognize its gravity, can culminate in unspeakable tragedy. Lisa Coleman. In June 1995, 27-year-old Lisa Coleman appeared to lead a modest life in southeast Texas. She shared a cramped apartment with her girlfriend, Marcella Williams, and together they cared for Marcella's elderly father, Devin Williams, a frail 99-year-old man who trusted Lisa implicitly. But behind closed doors, Lisa was trapped in an escalating vortex of resentment and desperation. Tormented by memories of childhood abuse and plagued by poverty, Lisa found a twisted solace in Marcella's own descent into instability. Unbeknownst to the frail Devin, his granddaughter's girlfriend was crawling toward a final, horrifying decision. For weeks before the fateful day, neighbors reported hearing Lisa and Marcella arguing late into the night. Whispers circulated that Lisa had recently lost her job and faced eviction. While Marcella visited her son across town, Lisa stoked the embers of a plan that would send shockwaves through Huntsville Unit. On June 10, 1995, Lisa lured the elderly man alone into his dimly lit kitchen under the pretense of preparing his favorite meal. Devin's frail hands trembled as he set the table. In a blur of motion, Lisa produced a length of fabric, looped it around Devin's neck, and yanked with all her might. When he crumpled to the linoleum floor, unmoving, she dragged his motionless body into the living room, propped his head on a couch cushion and coldly searched his pockets for cash. With Devin's bank card and checks in hand, Lisa stashed the stolen funds in her backpack and fled the apartment. Over the next 24 hours, she drained the elderly man's accounts, buying designer clothes, flashy jewelry, and treating herself to a lavish dinner at a local steakhouse. When police arrived at the crime scene, they discovered Devin's body, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. It wasn't long before financial investigators noticed suspicious charges on his credit card. Surveillance footage captured a woman matching Lisa's description, swiping the card at an upscale boutique. By dusk the next day, detectives knocked on Lisa's door. She answered calmly, feigning innocence, but the weight of evidence collapsed any pretense of surprise. In court, prosecutors offered a chilling portrait of a predator who preyed on her victim's kindness and longevity. They described the strangulation in gruesome detail, how Lisa had wrapped the fabric around Devin's neck, lengthened the loop to ensure a swift death. She remained silent as they recounted how she abandoned his body, then lived large on his dwindling savings. When the prosecution rested, they asked jurors to imagine a world where the vulnerable elderly could trust no one. Lisa's defense attorneys argued that she suffered from untreated borderline personality disorder and an extreme dissociative episode following years of childhood sexual abuse. Yet testimony revealed she meticulously planned every step. The jury found her guilty, and in 1996, the judge imposed the death penalty. Lisa Coleman spent the next 2 decades on death row at the Huntsville unit, where inmates struggled under harsh conditions and desolate isolation. Her appeals spotlighted prosecutorial misconduct, allegations that investigators coerced her into confessing, and highlighted the failure to account for her history of trauma. But even with mounting public sympathy and letters from human rights advocates, the courts refused to grant a reprieve. On September 17, 2014, Lisa Coleman walked into the death chamber, having been condemned for depriving an innocent man of dignity and life. Because Texas had abolished last meal requests, she received the standard prison fare before the injection. As muscles slackened and consciousness faded, Lisa whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I love my children." Her final words reflecting the bitterness of her choices and the hollow cost of stolen trust. Her death forced California's lawmakers to confront how trauma unaddressed can metastasize into violence, and how a society that thrives on giving second chances can falter when its most vulnerable slip through the cracks. Erica Shepard. At just 19 years old, Erica Shepard's world was a furnace of abuse and instability. Growing up in Houston, she slipped between relatives' homes, never finding steady ground. By adolescence, she was pregnant and dropping out of school, her spirit fractured by early encounters with sexual violence. When she met 20-year-old James Dickerson, she found both companionship and danger. Together, they drifted through Houston's battered neighborhoods, surviving on petty theft and pilfered handouts. And then, on a rainy night in June 1993, their paths collided with Marilyn Meagers. Marilyn, a middle-aged woman known for her kindness, had permitted Erica and James to stay the night at her apartment in southwest Houston. In exchange, they promised to fix plumbing issues that had plagued Marilyn for months. But instead of mending pipes, the pair arrived with a baseball bat and a knife, determined to steal her late-model Cadillac. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare. Marilyn awoke to the sounds of shattering glass. James lunged with a gleaming blade. Erica swung the bat again and again, each blow a crescendo of violence. Marilyn's cries echoed through the halls as blood slicked the tiled floor. When it was over, Marilyn lay motionless, her life extinguished in a merciless explosion of brutality. In the hours that followed, Erica and James fled Marilyn's apartment, leaving behind their blood-soaked weapons. They pawned Marilyn's watch and spent the stolen cash on rent and methamphetamine, squandering any chance of escape. Investigators found fingerprints on the bat and knife, and surveillance footage from a pawn shop placed Erica at the transaction. When the police raided her foster mother's home 5 days later, Erica surrendered, her pale face etched with disbelief that a child once promised a future could become an instrument of doom. During her trial, Erica's attorneys hammered on her horrific upbringing, her mother's neglect, a father absent from birth, the repeated sexual assaults that etched themselves into her psyche. Psychiatric experts testified that Erica suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and severe depression, her brain rewired to respond to conflict with self-preservation or aggression. But the prosecution refused to soften its portrayal. They offered jurors a montage of Marilyn's final moments, her pleas for mercy, the cruelty in Erica's eyes as bone snapped under the bat. They argued that, despite her youth, Erica made a conscious choice to kill for material gain. The jury convicted Erica Shepherd of capital murder, and she became one of the youngest black women on death row in Texas. In her final appeal, her legal team argued that a teenage mind ravaged by trauma should never face execution. They petitioned for life without parole, highlighting how Erica's diminished capacity and history of abuse demanded leniency. The court refused. In October 1995, at just 21 years old, Erica Shepherd was executed by lethal injection. For her final meal, she requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea, a nod to childhood comforts long denied. Her last words were a whispered plea. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Erica's execution flashed through headlines, stirring debates about youth in the criminal justice system and the unrelenting cycle of violence begetting violence. Her story lingers as a stark reminder that beneath every condemned person lies a fractured human, broken by forces often beyond their control.